So hello, everyone. My name is Tessa Green. I'm the program director of the Good Systems Grand Challenge. I want to thank you for joining us and kicking off this Good Systems sponsored week of programming to explore how procurement guidelines can influence the development of AI for good. This week's programming represents a first of its kind collaboration between a university and the World Economic Forum. As one of 3 UT Austin Grand Challenges, Good Systems brings together researchers from across the UT campus to investigate how we can ensure AI technologies benefit society. This partnership with the World Economic Forum showcases our combined commitment to improving the state of the world through AI and technology. And it's now my pleasure to introduce the president of the University of Texas at Austin, Jay Hartzell, to provide the official welcome. Jay.
Great, thank you, Tessa. It's my honor to welcome the World Economic Forum to the University of Texas at Austin. We're proud to support this groundbreaking program exploring AI procurement guidelines. Ultimately, government procurement is a measure of how democratic values are expressed in market settings. Not only can such guidelines help ensure that governments utilize AI in ethical and democratic ways, they also help more widely infuse those values across the market. In other words, governments buy a lot of stuff, and making sure the stuff they buy is ethically manufactured ensures a better AI landscape for all. But while the idea behind procurement guidelines is quite simple, how we construct such guidelines and our reasons for doing so are varied and complex. It creates a series of questions that stretches across both the arts and the sciences and involves partnerships with governments and business. That's why here at UT, we support cross-disciplinary investigations and complex research initiatives, such as Good Systems, one of the university's 3 grand challenges being pursued through our Bridging Barriers program. We started the Bridging Barriers program 5 years ago by asking researchers and students across campus to tell us what they saw as the world's biggest social, humanitarian, and environmental challenges. Good Systems was selected as a grand challenge because AI represents one of the world's most exciting and disturbing technological developments of our lifetime. Today, we find AI everywhere, from military weapons and epidemiological modeling to Netflix recommendations and dating apps. As with any technology, AI helps us to perform tasks with greater speed, efficiency, and accuracy. And yet, as with any technology, there are inherent pitfalls. Most notably, innovation tends to reflect our fears and prejudices, as well as virtues and ideals. This is why AI can help prevent equipment failures on oil rigs or be deployed to optimize EMS response times during extreme weather events. It's also why AI can promote fake news through social media bots. Furthermore, from biased algorithms used in facial recognition systems to software programs that predict recidivism in parole hearings, AI has the capacity to both mimic and amplify injustice. That's why here at UT, we're working to better understand AI, so we can imagine and anticipate positive developments, as well as mitigate unintended consequences. In these endeavors, we're phenomenally well positioned. We boast first-class resources such as the Texas Advanced Computing Center, the world's fastest supercomputer housed at an academic institution. We're also home to the Machine Learning Laboratory, a collaboration with the National Science Foundation, and a new robotics lab in partnership with the Army Futures Command. AI is a focus of UT's Technology and Information Policy Institute, led by Sharon Strover. AI is an important topic over at the Urban Information Lab, led by Jung Feng and at the Institute for Media Innovation, led by Craig Watkins. Finally, AI features prominently in the work of our Research Innovation and Economic Impact team, led by Dickson Thiessen. You'll be hearing from each of these people later in the program after Kay Firth Butterfield shares with us her thoughts. Kay, we're indebted to you for joining us today. I'm sure your insights will get our week of learning off to an incredible start. And I'd be remiss not to point out that in addition to being the head of AI and machine learning and a member of the executive committee at the World Economic Forum, Kay is also a fellow at the Strauss Center for International Security and Law here at UT. In closing, I'll leave you with 2 thoughts, one pessimistic and one optimistic. In 1909, the English novelist E.M. Forster published a short story, The Machine Stops, in which he describes a world dominated by smart technologies that serve humans so efficiently they become a gilded cage. In Forster's imagining, human passions still blundered up and down the machine, taking on a life of their own so that people no longer resent or resist them. I won't spoil the story for you, but let's just say it doesn't end well for anyone. On the other hand, I want to point you to Florence Nightingale, who revolutionized military hospitals for British soldiers fighting in the Crimean War during the 1850s. A renowned symbol of compassion and care, Nightingale was less well known as a pioneering data scientist. As described in James Scott's 2018 book, AIQ, Nightingale collected statistics, analyzed them, and then aggressively implemented reforms, particularly in relation to hygiene. By doing so, she dramatically improved outcomes for the patients in her care. Her reforms were later adopted across the world. As Scott points out, she is a model for how compassion, data, and technology can combine to make the world a better place. I cite these two examples, one literary, one historical, to demonstrate the tension we must walk in relation to AI, the tension between pessimism and optimism. Ultimately, UT is an optimistic place. We believe that what starts here can change the world. And while we're mindful of the risks AI brings, we're excited for the future and what AI has to offer. So with that in mind, have a great week in which you can both heed Forrester's warnings and celebrate Nightingale's examples. Back to you, Tessa.
Thank you, President Hartzell. Before we begin, a few housekeeping details. This event is being recorded and will be shared with registrants and available on our website following the event. And we also want to invite you to submit questions through the Q&A tab on the Zoom menu at the bottom of your screen. We'd also like it if you would upvote questions that you'd like the panelists to answer. Now for our event, the importance of sharing work globally on AI and ethics. Kay Firth Butterfield is the head of AI and ML and a member of the Executive Committee of the World Economic Forum. She is one of the foremost experts in the world on the topic of governance of AI. Kay is a barrister, former judge, professor, co-founder of AI Global, a technologist and entrepreneur, just to name a few. And she has an interest in how humanity can equitably benefit from new technologies, especially AI. For International Women's Day on March 8th, Kay was featured in the New York Times 10 Women Changing the Landscape of Leadership, with her piece titled, How Can AI Actually Benefit Humans? She's working on it. We are so grateful to Kay for all she has done in getting this week of programming set up and for joining us today. Sharon Strover, a founding member of the Good Systems Grand Challenge, is the Philip G. Warner Regents Professor in Communications at UT and directs the Technology and Information Policy Institute. Her research examines local and statewide networks and broadband services, the relationship between economic outcomes and the internet, mis- and disinformation, the digital divide, and rural broadband deployment. Now, to set the stage for this important week of programming, it is my pleasure to introduce Kay Firth Butterfield and Sharon Strover.
Great. Thank you so much. It's really a pleasure to be here. And it's a special pleasure to be able to have a conversation with Kay Firth Butterfield, whom I've known for several years in a lot of different venues. And she is a delightful and innovative and person with whom you can always have a very challenging conversation. I thought we could start out with a question that kind of sets the stage for what we're doing here tonight and ask you to tell us a little bit more about the Economic Forum, the World Economic Forum, and why it and you are involved in policy work.
Certainly, Sharon, and it's an absolute pleasure to be here. I remember meeting you on a plane. I can't remember where we were going, but one of those things that I always say, talk to the person sitting next to you on the plane. And so we've come a long way since that first conversation. What's the World Economic Forum? I think most people would know the World Economic Forum for the gatherings that we put together around the world, but most notably Davos, which is in January in the snowy Alps. And there we convene the world's leaders from business, academia, cultural leaders, government leaders, and nonprofit and international organization leaders to discuss the world's problems and what's pressing that we should all be dealing with if we are all committed to improving the state of the world. We have 1,000 business partners whose businesses are valued at 5 billion plus. Many of them are global companies, and so it is truly a global perspective. And we have a number of members. They would be small startup members. And why am I here? Why am I doing this? Well, Professor Schwab wrote a book called The Fourth Industrial Revolution. And Professor Schwab is the chair and founder of the World Economic Forum. And in that book, he talked about what we now all talk about, the Fourth Industrial Revolution, and the technologies that would power it, of which, of course, AI was one. And he commented that actually we needed to be careful about how we walked into the future with these technologies. And so he set up the Center for the Fourth Industrial Revolution in San Francisco, which is where when I'm not in lockdown, I'm based, but I'm pleased to be in Austin during lockdown. And so he appointed me in 2017, and I have been leading a team from San Francisco, also from our offices in Japan and China and India, since then, looking at what I suppose we could call responsible uses of artificial intelligence. And basically what I'm doing is trying to build those ethically firm foundations so that we can use AI for beneficial means in the future, because I personally believe that, like the president said, there are lots of really good uses for AI, but we really have to make sure that we have our eyes open as we begin to use this technology. And we have to think about what the future is that we as humans want to achieve using these technologies. We also have, and it's relevant for the procurement thing, we also have 9 affiliates in different countries around the world. And so some of the work that we do in San Francisco and elsewhere trickles down to them and vice versa.
A lot of the international and national considerations of responsible AI devolve into discussions of regulation. And classically, we often think of regulation as being either structural or behavioral. Behavioral is, you won't do that, we don't want you to do this, stay away from that. And structural is, we don't want you to get too big, you can't own this and this and this. And you no cross ownership in certain realms and so forth. When some of the folks in the Good Systems team were kicking around the idea for this forum, the word procurement came up, and you used it a minute ago, and I immediately said, don't use that word. It's boring. Eyes glaze over procurement. But procurement is a type of regulation in a way. Some people might call it soft regulation or even soft law, but it's fundamentally positioning the government as a significant user, right? So that the government can kind of throw its weight around here. Why work on procurement right out of, I assume it's right out of the gate, which is not to say you're not doing other things too.
Yeah, yes, absolutely. We are doing lots of other things. We have 16 ongoing projects and a big global initiative. But when I went to the forum and I was asked, well, what are the 2 things you're going to do that are going to move the needle forward? One was, how do I empower the boards and C-suites of businesses to be able to think about the AI that they're going to deploy and the ethical or responsibility that they have as they deploy that. And the second thing I felt that we could really move the needle on is in this procurement. So as you probably know, in 2018, governments around the world spent $13 trillion on procurement. And that was the time that I was thinking about this work. And I was fortunate because the UK government came to us and started talking to us about the fact that they didn't want to regulate AI. They thought it was the wrong time to regulate AI. but they did want to move the needle and signal to suppliers that they had a real interest in procurement of ethical AI. And so we scratched our heads and we came up with the fact that the procurement and the soft law version of regulation might be a place where we could make an enormous amount of difference without the mechanisms of legislation.
So were there difficulties in the UK in moving that forward and getting these sorts of guidelines adopted? Certainly avoiding regulation has merits in the scenario that you describe.
Yeah, certainly. So actually, I don't think we had a lot of problems. We had a lot of buy-in from the government across its many ministries. You may know that the UK government has something called the Office of AI, and the Office of AI bridges DCMS, which is the Digital Ministry, and BAIS, which is the Innovation Ministry. And, you know, one of the things that people are always saying is regulation kills innovation. So here we have put together the two ministries that really needed to think this through together. And also, as I say, we had the Office of AI. The Office of AI supplied us with a fellow who came to San Francisco and worked with my team for 18 months on this. But also she went home to England. She courted all the other ministries. She's a consummate diplomat. And she brought all these ministries together to workshop each step of the way of these guidelines and workbook. And so what we wanted to do was, as I say, we wanted to create law that was not law, because we wanted it to be iterative. What we don't know, what we think we know is that by the time you've legislated something, everything's moved on so much that your legislation is probably redundant. Whereas with this soft way of doing soft governance, we were creating something that was iterative and something that was easily iterated. Again, regulation takes a long time to change once you put it in place. It allowed the government to say, these are our ethical tolerance levels. And so we were able to really free up the market to know what was expected of them. And this is one of the great problems with, you know, innovation or regulation. It's difficult to be totally innovative. It's difficult for companies to put money into, for example, AI and healthcare, if they don't know whether the government's going to regulate them out of existence. And so this gave them that roadmap. It gave them that confidence to spend R&D dollars or pounds in the UK. And it gave the government the opportunity to say, well, this is what we want. So no, it wasn't difficult. We were very, very fortunate to have this fabulous fellow. And of course, we produced the tools, which are the guidelines, which came into force in September 2018. I've missed the year, 2018. And then the workbook as well to explain how to use the guidelines. And the whole came into force on the 1st of July, 2020.
You're making it sound as if it was really a fairly smooth process. And, and I'm wondering if that can really be replicated in a lot of other countries. And there's a related question to that, and that has to do with power differentials across countries. Large countries that are big buyers can probably pull off something like that. What about smaller countries? Does this process kind of leave them out?
No, I don't think it does, because what we did was we created something that is a tool. We call it Procurement in a Box. And you can take it off the shelf, you can look at it, you can say, well, these guidelines would work for us. but these wouldn't, and we need to put some different guidelines in that would work for us. And you can take the workbook and say, okay, how much of this can we translate? And literally in Colombia, we translated it, we just finished translating it into Spanish with a view to the Colombian government adopting it. And we've had adoption conversations with many countries around the world, which I can talk about if you want me to.
Well, I was just wondering what other countries are kind of in the near-term framework that you're working with.
Sure. So we spent a week in November last year with the Department of Defense here in the United States. As you probably know, the DoD created this entity called JAKE, which is responsible for thinking about ethics throughout the DoD. That is a very complex system, as you can imagine, with many departments. And so now, having workshopped it with them, obviously we're leaving them to think about how they implement it. We're just about to start work with Australia. And of course, both the United States and Australia are federated systems. One of the reasons we had such an easy time, I think, with the UK is that it's not a federated system in the same sense that, you have the federal government and the states in America and in Australia. We are working with the Inter-American Development Bank to actually introduce it across Caribbean, Central America, and South America. And we have done some work, we're in process of working with the World Bank for them to require it of any country that's borrowing money from them in order to implement AI.
Very interesting. And in as much as your primary stakeholders, well, maybe it's wrong to say your primary stakeholders are businesses, but it sounds as if their presence certainly had a powerful role in kind of coming up with this way of approaching.
Well, we're an impartial organization that works with multiple stakeholders. So everything that we do has to have the government, the business, the academia, and the nonprofit involved in them. And so this project was a classic project that brought everybody from those four stakeholders into the project. And so the British government, but also businesses that would sell to the British government, academics who have been studying procurement, and non-profits that had their own views, particularly around responsible artificial intelligence. And of course, when I was talking about countries, we tested it in Bahrain and the UAE as well. So that's another set of jurisdictions around the world.
Interesting. One of your reports on AI alluded to the phenomena of third-party audits and kind of coming up with explainable AI as being very formative in designing your procurement policies. Can you elaborate a little bit on that? Or are there other factors that you think were equally or more significant?
Yes, I think that what we know is that there are now about 175 different sets of principles around artificial intelligence from all around the world.
Only 175?
Sorry?
I said only 175?
Well, I think there are probably more than that, but that was the number that PwC gave me a year or so ago. And what was most interesting about the piece of work that they did was they looked at all these and then they gathered the principles together. And it turns out that we as human beings really care about 10 things. And explainability, accountability, transparency, they're all part of one bucket of things that we care about. And of course, governments have to care about it, because if you're going to use AI with your citizens, you have to be able to explain why a decision was made. You know, if you're going to stop someone's social security, they're probably going to want to know why you made that decision. And if it was a computer that made it, they probably want to know why the computer made it. And so this explainability issue, which is still so hard to do, and we're still working on it, that and the transparency, the accountability, is just so important for governments.
Mm-hmm. And any role for these third-party audits?
Yes, third-party audits are, so I started my work on ethical AI with the IEEE, and our work there around setting the standards for ethical AI. And now I think there are 12 of them still in the pipeline. This is hard stuff, but that sort of external audit is something that we are all playing with. And whether that's a certification mechanism or whether it's something different that is more like an accounting audit, we have yet to design. But we're still early on. We're doing our best, is what I have to say.
Yeah. There are a lot of folks associated with our university attending tonight, and probably other universities, as well as some folks from the city of Austin here. And as you may know, we've crafted an interlocal agreement with the city of Austin around some of these issues. And I was wondering if you could comment on the role of academic researchers in developing these kinds of guidelines, and maybe you could speak to what role they may have had in these procurement guidelines.
Yes, certainly. I mean, I think academia is absolutely vital because you are at the cutting edge of a lot of this work. And so, of course, you should be involved in all the work. I absolutely, we have 2 fellows from academia. Perhaps I should make this an open invitation for a fellow from UT. But so someone from McGill, and she brings her expertise to a project she's working on in human resources. That's her research area, and she can translate it with other stakeholders into something that businesses and governments can use. So it's vital. It's enormously important to have that expertise. And I think the City of Austin has done a great thing by asking you to work with them.
Terrific. After procurement, what do you think the next regulatory or quasi-regulatory strategy might be that you will investigate?
So we've been doing a lot of work on thinking about how companies can actually self-regulate. And so we have a number of projects on that. We have a number of projects that are simply educational. So the board toolkit, when we surveyed boards, we found that very many boards of directors of boards didn't understand what AI was, and yet they were being asked to oversee the deployment of artificial intelligence. And so we created that. We've been working with New Zealand, the government of New Zealand. Again, a different sort of government because it prides itself in being a policy testbed. And so they are looking at how do you have a significant public conversation about the deployment of artificial intelligence in government. And although we can't do that, take that and say we can do that in America, what we can say is we could take that work and perhaps you could do it with the City of Austin. And because it's a smaller group that you can actually have a proper conversation about. And one of the things that really worries me about this is that if we don't have a conversation with members of the public, if members of the public are not taken with us on this path, then all their awful conceptions of Terminator are the only things that they take forward on this journey.
Mm-hmm. Do you have any recommendations for how to convey these sorts of issues and possible solutions to the public?
Oh, yes. As I say, we've got a whole project on it in New Zealand. Okay. So I would recommend looking at that. We've literally just published something on that. And I think that academia is so well placed because you are by and whole more trusted than government or than business. And also you have the facilities, you have the teachers, you have the potential to have meaningful conversations with members of the public.
Yeah, well, thank you. I know we were supposed to keep this short and bring in our panelists. So we have several panelists who will join us now to continue talking about this topic. And the first person I'd like to introduce is Christine Dickson Thiessen. Christine is the Associate VP for Research, Innovation, and Economic Impact at UT Austin. And her goal is to maximize the economic impact of the university's research enterprise through commercialization and industry engagement. She has worked in other states in similar roles, nonprofit corporations that were also supporting and moving forward local innovation economies. So, Christine, would you like to offer some opening remarks?
Certainly, yes. Thank you all so much for having me here today, and Kay for your thoughtful input throughout this. I did want to comment on the procurement guidelines that have been prepared and how much I appreciate how they level the playing field for entrepreneurs and small businesses that are interested in engaging in this area. Obviously, innovation and entrepreneurship is at the core of what I'm here to do, and being able to support those companies is crucial to UT Austin, but also to the economy. Apparently 13 trillion is the number of the day, Kay, because according to McKinsey, AI innovation and technology could ultimately, between now and 2030, contribute 13 trillion additional dollars to the global economy. That's a 16% cumulative increase in GDP globally, attributable to this approach and technology. So clearly there is a profound impact ahead through development of this. But we want to ensure that this is not solely the purview of the large leaders in this space already. And so looking at the procurement guidelines, first of all, thank you for tackling that. And I'll come back to that in a moment, why I'm so grateful for it. But I also appreciate that you all are focusing on the problem statement and not the specifications, the solutions, because that does open the door much more so to smaller businesses that may have a better solution than the large players in this space have as well. So thank you for that. But also looking at creating this market pull, that's something that me and my team here at UT Austin work with constantly. There's such a gap between research in the academic environment and getting it into the commercial marketplace. And one of the things we often do when we sit down with entrepreneurs and innovators is ask them what problem they're looking to solve, but also asking them what their customers want. And then trying to bring industry into that conversation so that there's a pull for the research that's being undertaken. And so what you all are proposing through these guidelines really enables insight and allows those innovators to see exactly what the need is that's being addressed and to approach it in a more collaborative fashion, while also ensuring that those ethical components are incorporated early on in the development process, not something that's tacked on as an afterthought or, oh dear, how do we do this now? It really is crucial to make certain that people are keeping that at the forefront of their thinking while they're developing these systems as well.
Great. Thank you so much. Let me now introduce my colleague, Jung Feng Zhao. Jung Feng is an associate professor in the School of Architecture here. He is chairing the Good Systems Grand Challenge this year, and he is also the chair of the Smart City Bridging Disciplines Program, which is an undergraduate interdisciplinary program, and director of the Urban Information Lab. His research focuses on urban informatics and machine learning, especially how different technologies come together to enable smart cities to take shape and how those environments can affect people. He has examined transit deserts and actually documented it in several major cities. And his research has been supported by the National Institutes of Health, NSF, the Department of Transportation on the federal level and on the state level, and the Washington Department of Transportation and UT Austin, among others. He's been quoted and been a resource for several national media outlets. So, Jung Feng.
Thank you so much, Sharon, and good evening, everybody. Thanks for attending this. Kay, I want to say, as the chair of Good System, I want to say thank you so much for hosted this forum with the UT Austin. As we all know, procurement has always been a very, very important topic, but they haven't received much attention until World Economic Forum decided to focus on that. So thank you so much for doing research on that, and thank you so much for sharing that. As Sharon mentioned, my research focuses on smart city. So what exactly is smart city? I cannot go in detail of all aspects of smart city. Here, I just want to mention how Good System has been invest and research in smart city areas, basically from 3 different perspectives. So first is health, the second part is transportation, the third part is housing. So we, as a group, Good System has invested many research projects related to smart city. Related to health, we have been working on trying to use AI and machine learning, trying to understand how residents' mental or physical health is related to the built environment or the community they live in. At the situation like this, it's become an even more important topic. So we hope when government decide, especially for city, decide to purchase different AI technology for health purpose, they will purchase ethically and they use equitably. The second project we focus on is the transportation. As we all know, transportation is a modern blood for our society. As a whole, Good System has invested in multiple different transportation projects related to AI and machine learning. So the first project, we have developed the robotic-based last mile delivery system using AI to navigate on campus, trying to reduce the contact during the COVID-19 situation. The second project, we're trying to use AI, trying to understand how the shared mobility, whether it's Uber or Lyft or shared bike or shared e-scooter, has been distributed within cities. Within the city of Austin, how can we better regulate and deploy it within the cities? The last project I want to mention is related to housing. As we all know, lack of affordable housing is a major problem in the states, whether Seattle, Boston, Bay Area, or anywhere, almost a major city in the US. Of course, Austin is no exception. In 2015, Austin Round Rock area had become one of the most economically segregated areas in the US. With around 3,000 people moving to Austin, the disparity is getting worse. So how can government better develop and provide more affordable houses to the city and make people enjoy the city and find a place to live in? That's our major research area. And we have been collected 30 years of housing development data in the city of Austin. We use AI method trying to understand how the different policies related to housing development had resulted in more or less affordable housing in the city of Austin. So we hope this research will provide some guidance or suggestion for future when government decide to develop different housing projects. And of course, we believe AI, as you already mentioned, will play a major role in this process. Again, government procurement is super important for smart city and for the local government. How the government decide to purchase or different AI technology will have a direct impact on smart city development. In the last day of this panel, we will have a specific section focused on AI, procurement, and smart city. So with that being said, I will hand over to Sharon.
Okay, let me introduce Craig Watkins. Craig is my colleague in the School of Journalism and Media, and he's the Good Systems Racial Justice Research Director and the Ernest A. Sharp Centennial Professor in the Moody College of Communication here at UT. He's also the founding director of the Institute for Media Innovation, a research and design hub here. Craig is an internationally recognized scholar, author of 6 books that explore the relationship between race, technology, and social transformation. His current projects address the intersection between racial equity and artificial intelligence, with a special emphasis on how the design of technology systems and community-based engagement can strengthen the ethical and racial justice oriented applications of AI. Craig.
Thank you, Sharon, for the introduction, and thank you to Good Systems for this week of events with the World Economic Forum. So Sharon mentioned I'm working on a few different things, but primarily thinking about the intersection between artificial intelligence and racial justice, racial equity kinds of initiatives. As we proceed with this conversation both tonight and throughout the week in terms of governments and procurement of AI and some of the issues at stake, one of the lens through which I would like to look at these issues and think about these issues is through the lens of equity, right? And how do we think about the equity implications of the AI systems that governments are purchasing and acquiring? And maybe over the course of this conversation, there may be an opportunity for me to expand a bit more on the work that we're doing with Good Systems and the city of Austin to do, in essence, a kind of an exploration of the ways in which various departments within the city, public health, education, transportation, housing, et cetera, the degree to which they are thinking about artificial intelligence, both today and tomorrow, through an equity lens. I think Kay mentioned that $13 trillion figure. And she mentioned also a survey or study that the World Economic Forum has done with boards around these issues. And one of the things that she noted is something that we've also began to find in our research, both here in Austin, but also elsewhere as well. And that is, even as cities migrate towards adopting these systems and integrating them deeper and deeper into their sort of everyday operations, and how they serve the public that they serve, they're oftentimes doing it with little to no understanding and recognition of the equity implications of these systems. And cities are certainly not unique in this way. We're all learning, right, about the ways in which issues of fairness and bias and transparency are beginning to define these systems in ways that drive us towards wanting to both understand them better and also thinking about the ways in which we can integrate them in ways that don't undermine our equity goals as opposed to advancing our equity goals. So looking forward to being able to talk a bit more about this work this evening and certainly over the course of the week.
Great, thank you. Well, look, those are some very quick snapshots of some of the topics and the current thinking of our panelists. I was wondering if I could get some things started by bringing up a word I haven't heard anybody mention, and that word is risk. I bring it up because I think a lot of organizations, both on the supply side, the commercial firms, as well as governments, are extremely risk averse. That might be especially heightened in the United States. We're a very litigious society, it seems to me. It's so risk is a sort of tacit presence in a lot of transactions around new technologies when there might be unintended consequences, when not everybody really understands what the technology can do, is capable of doing. And I'm wondering where a risk assessment process enters into our development of ethical AI systems. Is that a word we should embrace and meet head on, or something else?
I could certainly take that, because I could go back to the board toolkit, and we did create a whole section which is to deal with risk. So as you probably know, members of boards sit on governance or audit and risk committees or strategy committees. So we took audit and risk and said, if you sit on the audit and risk committee of your company and it is deploying AI, these are the things that you should be thinking about. And I think when I first started doing a lot of this work, it was back in the dark ages of 2014. And in those days, we were talking about ethical risks. And I think we probably still are, but we moved on maybe to responsible AI. But when I talk to businesses, I tend to just say, these are the problems that you are going to encounter if you are going to deploy AI in your company. And problems and risks, I think, are much more intelligible to corporates.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I don't know if anybody else wants to respond to that or has any thoughts on it.
I think the risk component is a really interesting one to think about. You know, in our conversations with the city of Austin, we've tried to sort of reframe the conversation around risk and risk aversion. And so whereas, maybe in the past, the way forward may have been to, well, let's not, ask these kinds of questions, or let's not invite collaboration from researchers to come in and explore how we're using technology, facial recognition, other intelligence systems to survey crowds or to manage crowds or to manage public demonstrations at the risk of embarrassing, right? City officials and public safety officials. And what we've tried to do is to turn that upside down and to say that the real risk may be not doing these kinds of investigations, right? That you run the risk of continuing to expose your organizations, city government, and leadership to these kinds of challenges that we see occurring over and over and over again, in terms of, again, these sort of equity implications that are deeply implicated in these systems, in terms of fairness, in terms of justice. And so you could almost make the case, right, that not to engage these issues, not to take them seriously, not to build mechanisms and partnerships that allow them to deal with these issues in a much more effective and proactive way, is in fact a risky venture in and of itself.
Mm-hmm.
I just want to add one thing, follow Craig's comment. I think a risk has always been existing, and most time we just overlook the existing risk. So by looking at the risk associated with technology, we realize it's a double-sided sword. So we're not just gonna enjoying the advancement of technology, we're also bearing the risk associated with that. So that's something I think is very important to realize.
Mm-hmm.
And looking at the risk perspective, it certainly influences the development and innovation aspect of it. If the innovator has blinders on and is refusing to see where the exposures are for the system that they're creating, their system's going to be full of faults. And so they do need to step back and do a risk assessment themselves, but that also depends on the end user Who is the stakeholder that's going to be applying this? Is it corporate? Is it government? That dramatically shifts the risk profile as well.
And I think just in this last year, I would say maybe the last 6 months, I have had VCs come to me and say, we want to think about responsible AI and which startups we invest in, which companies we invest in, because A, it's important in and of itself, and B, you know, a lot of those companies, they want to sell, and so they want to be a product that some of the big tech companies that are now really seriously thinking about responsible AI and have set up committees and things, you know, you're not going to be able to sell if you haven't thought about this at ground level.
Some of the ongoing work that another team is undertaking as part of Good Systems Research, a team that I'm privy to, has profiled how different cities are approaching technology acquisitions, specifically camera technology acquisitions. And we observe something that I'll throw out as a very preliminary theory. We observe that the economies and the efficiencies of AI-enhanced technology are abundant, and they're really evident. And a lot of the people or the strata that of management that wants to adopt AI is keenly interested in achieving those efficiencies. However, the management layer is often somewhat separate from the political layer. The political folks who have to interact with the irate citizen who has gone through a red light camera or something like that, or the groups that find that some of these technologies are used in ways that people in the community were unaware of. So there's political pushback that can be very surprising to the people who actually contracted for the technology to begin with, with the best of intentions to simply make things more efficient, save costs, do things better, and so forth. Are there some good ways that we can begin to bridge some of those gaps at different layers of governance?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, it's. I think that's a really interesting, tension, that you note. So in this work that we're doing with the city of Austin, part of it's sort of a multi-dimensional effort, many different components, procurement being one, but another one, right, in terms of thinking about these issues through an equity lens is the community engagement component, and the scenario that you just mapped out. In some ways, I think aligns quite well with how we're thinking about that aspect of this. So in other words, what I mean is we are at a moment where I think there's a growing recognition that not to have opportunities for public comment, opportunities for citizens to actually engage, right? City managers, engage city planners, those who are in charge of adopting and deploying these systems. I think there's a growing recognition that there needs to be some type of opportunity, some type of mechanism for community voices and expertise, right, to be shared and to have input. This is my vision, right, and not just in terms of the work that we're doing here in Austin, but in fact, the work that's happening across this country and around the world, is that in 5 to 10 years, the idea, right, that a police department would be using cameras or be using other kinds of intelligence systems without some engagement with the community would just not be acceptable, right? And that they would understand the need to go forward to the public, have conversations. We're seeing examples of this both here in this country and elsewhere, but it's not only, right, demonstrating responsibility and concern about the public, but recognizing, right, that they offer perspective, they offer expertise, lived experience that can help departments and organizations better understand the utility of these systems and how to deploy them in ways that don't undermine equity goals.
I don't know if the other panelists have some thoughts on this.
Well, simply that efficiency may not be your holy grail. If you're working in government, then you've got to have lots of other things that you should be thinking about, and your interaction with the citizens and what those citizens want their city or country to look like should be at the forefront of your mind. And the cost saving and efficiency is just one part of what should be a much more nuanced conversation and consideration. It is in companies, and so it should be in government. One of the things that I would say is, I have tried to encourage governments and cities and states around the world to really have a conversation and to create a national AI strategy or an AI strategy. Companies don't do things, they don't spend money without creating these strategies, but all too often we're finding that countries have not done so. I think we're up to about 35 national AI strategies in the world now, and that's lamentable.
I'd like to remind the audience that you can submit questions in the Q&A, and there'll be an opportunity to take those up. I'd like to turn to Christine, who offered some introductory remarks that were very that elicited the notion of how important this vein of research can be for the university and for what the university can bring to the commercialization processes around AI and systems that can engage industry productively. I was wondering if you have some examples of specific approaches that have worked well in this domain space.
Not specifically to the AI domain. However, I would like to use this opportunity to emphasize that we appreciate the value of the work that's being done here, not just from an economic impact, but from a social impact perspective as well. And the teams that we've built here at UT Austin within the innovation and entrepreneurship realm are there to specifically coach innovators from conception of the idea all the way through proof of concept, beyond to spinning out a company, and ultimately helping those companies be successful in attracting investors and potential customers. So our role here in my team is to ensure that from the very start to translation out into the commercial marketplace, there is seamless support for our innovators. And that applies to AI as well as it does any other technological realm. And so even being able to make connections from a government perspective for the ultimate consumers of, I don't like referring to them as consumers, it makes it sound tawdry, but those that are using these systems to be able to have their voice be heard early on in the process. Again, back to my comment about how much I appreciate the transparency of these guidelines, because it really demystifies for the innovators what the need is that they are trying to develop a solution for. So no, not a particular one in AI, unfortunately, but to come quite soon. I'm confident of that.
I didn't know if Jung Feng had wanted to weigh in on that or not. Yeah.
Sure. Not on that's a specific topic, but I saw a question from the Q&A, and if you don't mind, I can answer that question. So
maybe we should set up the question. This is from a former UT student who received his PhD here, who is commenting on transparency reporting as another soft regulation, in the sense that openness, so-called transparency, isn't exactly behavioral, isn't exactly structural, and that transparency regulations could be very fruitful in furthering some of the goals of ethical behavior and above board behavior.
Yeah, so yeah, thank you, Sharon, for explaining the question. So basically, I think the transparency of the data and the model is super, super important for AI. As we all know, the AI or machine learning technology depend on mainly on the data quality. If we feed the model with the biased data, clearly we're gonna get a biased model. There's no doubt about that. I'll give you examples. So we all know facial recognition has some problem with people with darker skin, but I'll tell you a personal experience. The voice recognition with Apple also has some problem with people who doesn't speak standard English. So that's an example of a training data set. So if you have a biased, a limited, messy data set, you're gonna have a messy, unequitable AI models. Yes, transparency of data is super, super important, and that's across the discipline.
Could I invite the panelists to elaborate on transparency? Some data, I'll call them data activists, for example, have been very critical of a lot of the open data movement results because while data sets can be open, they can be impenetrable. If the metadata are not properly reported, the data are useless. Indeed, one of the loudest critics right now, Catherine D'Ignacio, who wrote the book Data Feminism, has said we really need very context-specific information about data sets. So transparency alone seems almost glib if we don't follow it up with a little bit more than that. I don't know if any of our panelists have worked with trying to make data transparent or what that has meant in some of your own endeavors.
Yeah, to me, I also think about it in relationship to, I think something else that's been referenced here is accountability.
Yeah.
And so to the extent that something can be rendered transparent, and there are questions about that, right? That these systems are becoming so complex now in terms of how they operate, how machines learn and function, that even the people who design these systems in some ways struggle with understanding how decisions are being made, how outputs are being produced, which to your point, Sharon, raises at least some questions about at least the limits of transparency. And we also know, right, that that a lot of these models are proprietary, and so there are challenges, there as well. And so it sort of asks, well, what are our pathways, right, to generating results, outcomes that are much more equitable and desirable, that may extend beyond transparency. And I'm really, increasingly struck by the accountability dimension, right? And that is, to what extent are organizations, vendors, companies held accountable, right, for the ill effects of the automated decision-making processes that they author or construct. And without really some type of accountability system or measure, a lot of this conversation around ethical and responsible AI, it's good in theory, but it doesn't really sort of push us perhaps in the decisive direction that we need to go in. So in other words, right, if you can sort of articulate, right, good intention, you have an ethics review board, or you have an ethics commission, and you're thinking about these issues, you maybe have a team internally that's addressing these issues. And yet your engineers, your designers, your managers are not held accountable, right, for the biased results and implications that these systems oftentimes can practice. To what extent is that really of value and significance to us in the long run? To us, I mean the public good. And so for me, when I think about transparency, I also think about it in relationship to the issue of accountability, and how do we begin to create measures, create systems, processes that began to, add some degree of, I guess, enforcement, more serious expectations in terms of the kinds of outcomes that we want to see from these systems.
Yeah.
I think I could just add on to Craig's point, perhaps 3 things. I mean, first of all, I think that in terms of data, this is one of the problems that we are having with, for example, access to justice. So we started a project on access to justice with the Indian government, only to find that trying to make access to justice easier is actually completely stopped, because most of the data isn't in machine readable form. And so, you have to, for very many countries in the world, and India is a huge economy, for very many countries in the world, you actually just have to take paper and make that machine readable. So that's one of the data problems. The second, to Craig's point about if the engineers are not being required to do something, and think about the ethical implications, then you're going to fail. So one of the projects that we're doing is actually suggesting that you bring diverse teams together right at the very beginning of any product that you create, so that your engineers can't do their thing, and then you think about ethics along the way. Also, because many of those engineers happen to be young men and they bring their own biases, if you can create a diverse team, diverse as to gender and race, etc., at the very beginning, then you can obviate some of those problems that you're going to encounter. And the third thing, and I would say this because I'm a lawyer by background, is I think that we just haven't got to the point of where the law starts to kick in. So we do have some good laws around bias and racism and things like that. We do, and presumably somebody will begin to take actions in this, and that then we'll see a liability system actually created in this area.
One question that has come in has to do with dealing with government procurement of AI solutions when it comes to non-democratic regimes, where the potential for abuse might be, well, one would expect it might be greater. The risks of abuse might seem too high, but the benefits could be there as well. Should there be, how should that situation be dealt with? Should there be overarching guidelines that industries selling to a democratic country follow as well when they deal with a non-democratic country?
Well, I can give you some examples and some thoughts that I have. The first is Salesforce. Mark Benioff was very distressed actually when he found that his technology was being used in relation to children being detained at the border. And so that's in a democratic country. And so what he did was he created a post, which I always get wrong, but I think it's the Chief Humane Use and Ethics Officer. It's held by Paula Goodman. And her remit is not just to look at AI, but to look at the use of technology and the sale of technology and who they're selling to across the whole business. Well, obviously, Mark's known as being an essentially great activist CEO, but that is one way of tackling a problem such as this. I think one of the things that I have been concerned about is the use of, and we've got a project on it, the use of AI-enabled toys. And if you put an AI-enabled toy in front of a 0 to 7-year-old and you don't monitor what it is saying to the child, then you can create that child's long-lasting values and belief systems, which then can't be shifted, or it's hard to shift because minds are very malleable at that time. And so, you could imagine people, whether they come from democratic countries or non-democratic countries, wanting to propound a certain belief system in children. And that's why we need some probably legislation. There may be some cases where we do need legislation and soft law is not sufficient.
Uh-huh.
And I would step it back a little bit further even to say that it's not about a democratic versus non-democratic country, and instead talk about the relationship between the innovator or the purveyor of the product and to whom they're selling it.
Mm-hmm.
That's much broader than just selling to the government. This is also about corporate responsibility and companies doing due diligence when they're selling a product to ensure that it's going to be used for the purpose it was intended and not for other uses that are abusive of the technology.
Yeah.
That is a step that most companies are not willing to take because that means they're going to be foregoing sales. So there does need to be an agreement within the industry that this is an ethical consideration that is of such value that they all need to agree that this is an approach they're going to take. Otherwise, some will have a competitive advantage because they're willing to sell under those circumstances when others are not. And so those that are acting in good faith are penalized economically.
Yes.
I agree with that. And, you see Brad Smith talking about facial recognition technology. Brad's the president of Microsoft. And one of the things he said about it, among as well as, this is a difficult technology, we need to think about the regulation of it, was, well, if we pull out, Microsoft and IBM, as we know, did pull out, then it opens the door. It actually doesn't create a level playing field because it opens the door for people who don't have the ethical boards that we have to actually enter the market. And so then, what's government going to do about that if you've got a playing field that's not level at all?
Yeah. That does sort of raise the specter of a system of not as bad as the other guy kind of being a dynamic that drives some of these outcomes, to kind of go back to Craig's comments on accountability, and without a structure for accountability. If every company has its own mechanism for accountability, are we better off? Or, or as Christine said, do we really need to get the industry to work together on this, which is more or less what you've been trying to catalyze at the World Economic Forum, right? I wanted to get Jung Feng's response on this, the specific and unique environment of smart cities, since you've directed a lot of your time and energy to those environments, which are replete with monitors, sensors, and a variety of AI-enhanced apparatuses. Is there something unique about smart cities that suggest they should be in the forefront here? Should there be special efforts with smart cities along the lines of these procurement guidelines, for example? Or are there other things that they should be doing?
Yeah, thank you, Sherry, for the question. So if you think about smart cities, basically it's a concept trying to make our cities more enjoyable, safer, equitable, and happy to live in. So I would say that the overall goal for smart city movement is for the people. It's not for the company, not for the government, not even for the technology. So that being said, I feel like when government decide to deploy or procurement or purchase some AI technology, they should think about how this technology will affect individual citizen or resident's life, not how this technology can save them budget, improve efficiency of the city. Yes, that's an important aspect. But the more important bottom line is how this technology will affect individual residents within the city. I mean, individual resident, all of them, not a certain segment of the resident within the city. So that's how I see how the AI procurement guidelines should be connected with the smart city. And the smart city itself has many, many different areas: smart transportation, smart energy, smart government, smart health. So all of them, again, the overall goal is how do we make a city more enjoyable? So if you have a technology very efficient in terms of save the energy, but very not equitable at all for the citizens. And I would say the government should not purchase that technology because that's not line up well with the overall goal with the smart city movement or revolution.
Mhm, mhm. Any responses on the smart city environment? Otherwise, I was going to turn to Craig because you had offered to elaborate on where racial justice and equity activity should fit in these processes. And I suspect that it is the city environments that are probably a little bit more ahead of the curve on that front compared to the environments that I spent a lot of time in my research, rural environments. But would you like to say a little bit more about some of the racial justice and equity concerns that come to bear here?
Yeah, I think we're all becoming increasingly sensitive to issues of algorithmic fairness, justice, bias, and as a result, I think there's growing sort of momentum, if you will, to influence, right, how these systems sort of impact our lives, right? In many ways, these systems are sort of building the future, and I think there's a growing recognition that we need more diverse forms of expertise, more diverse people participating in the building of this future, this AI data-driven future. So what we've been doing with the city of Austin is sort of building the foundations for what we think will be a longer term effort. Like many cities, Austin has an equity office. And the equity office is primary mission, right, is helping the city and its various departments advance the city's broader sort of equity goals. And 2-3 years ago, the equity office did a citywide, department-wide assessment of how each department was performing along a number of different equity indicators or metrics as a way of helping those organizations, one, to do a kind of internal kind of audit of how well they were performing on these metrics, identify strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, threats, sort of typical kind of SWOT analyses, and then help them as a result of doing some analysis of that data, develop a kind of equity action plan. And so what I proposed to them after becoming more familiar with this work is doing something very similar as it relates to the technology systems that the city is beginning to use. So what we're looking at doing is essentially building or designing what I would call a technology equity sort of toolkit or model that we would sort of build, test out with a couple of different departments, and then roll it out across the city to begin to start creating both a conversation, but also a mechanism for different departments across the city to start looking at their technology strategy, their application of technology, again, through this equity lens. And in order to do that, right, they have to basically do these kinds of internal assessments that allow us then to be able to do a broader, more wider sort of assessment of the larger landscape, and then to help each department develop an equity action plan moving forward. And the idea, again, right, is by building this toolkit, by building this sort of formal mechanism, it becomes a way in which different departments and the city itself can begin to have a much more robust and data-driven conversation around how its adoption and deployment of AI and other technology systems can be used to advance rather than to undermine or derail their equity goals.
Are some cities ahead of others in doing this and in putting in place some of these mechanisms?
Yeah, I think, I mean, they're different stages of development in terms of moving along this path. You know, some cities have done maybe not this department by department kind of assessment or analyses. And we're looking, again, procurement is one of potentially 3 or 4 other sort of broad sort of domains that we'll be looking at: strategy and policies and procedures, as well as this question of community engagement. So if you were to take out any one of those, right, I think there are some communities that are beginning to show some progress in terms of how do you engage the community around these systems. Again, as I was noting earlier, how do you identify and create formal mechanisms for citizens to have input on how these systems are being used? If it's facial recognition, if it's the cameras, Sharon, that you alluded to earlier. There are some cities that are beginning to create those kinds of conversations, creating those kinds of community-based mechanisms for that kind of engagement. You know, I'm familiar with a couple of other instances of cities producing reports. There was a task force that the city of New York created 2 or 3 years ago. It ended somewhat with some degree of controversy around some of the members of the task force not feeling as though the progress or the recommendations or even just the process of producing the sort of analyses of New York City's application of automated decision-making systems was effective or critical enough. But again, I think it's one instance or one example of cities becoming at least potentially more open to the idea of beginning to explore these questions with greater clarity, more focus, and the attempt to begin to design more equitable and better futures in terms of how these systems are being used.
And I just think, sorry,
Go ahead.
I just think it's so important that cities have this conversation because, you know, AI is the new trendy, sexy thing on the block. But actually the work that you do about making sure that everybody has access to the internet, that's the start of using these tools. And if some people remain disenfranchised, they're disenfranchised from the conversation about where we want to go as a society as well. And I was talking to Will.i.am at Davos this January. And, you know, he was talking about the number of children that he supports in Los Angeles that simply didn't have computers and didn't have access to the internet, and therefore just having these Zoom calls in order to continue receiving their education. So I think it's very easy for us to talk about AI, but there are some truly fundamental things that underpin this access and equality that we shouldn't forget.
Yeah. Thank you for that. Let me turn back to Christine to ask you a question in a similar vein. Do you see some best practices among universities in tackling these innovations, especially in terms of working with industries and the relevant stakeholders in these matters?
Again, I would say that it wouldn't be specific to AI. This is an approach that really needs to be adopted across technological realms. But really, again, engaging with industry, engaging with the government. I have to tell you, many times I speak with academic researchers and they say, well, have you spoken to someone at the DoD who's an ultimate, you know, purchaser of this product? And people are terrified at the thought of actually contacting those that will be ultimately adopting their technology. And so we need to overcome that issue from a cultural perspective and open up the doors for communications between those that are at the front end of innovation and research to those that are implementing and adopting the technology. And so doing that through having roundtables. So for example, at UT Austin, we have RIGs, which is research interest groups that spread across all of the disciplines within the institution, but then also look to bring industry into the conversation, again, to get that market validation for the work that is going on and ensuring that there's going to be impactful research that's conducted. But there's many other ways to do that through mentoring as well as through collaboration with industry and making it easier for industry partners to do work within the university and with our researchers in a collaborative fashion where it's not just doing what we decide the scope of work should be or what the industry partnership says the scope of work should be, but instead working together to really solve the problem collaboratively. So especially that's all the more important in AI, where access to data is crucial. Having that true real life data set that can be used to drive those algorithms is vital. And to industry, that's very precious information. As you can imagine, some of that is of such great competitive intelligence value that a lot of companies are hesitant to share that data. And so this is a two-way street. You know, we do need to also overcome that cultural challenge with industry and understanding that in order for us to develop the systems that they need, we need access to the data as well.
We're almost out of time. I thought I would give the panelists one final, a moment for any final remarks, something you've been waiting to say, but the moment did not come up. Or if you've said everything you want to say, that's fine too. But could we just have final comments from beginning with you, Jung Feng?
Yeah, I just want to thank you, Sharon and Kay and all the panelists for the wonderful discussion. I want to add one comment, follow Christine's comment. The data and the sharing data is super, super important. As we all know, I'll give you an example. Uber and Lyft and all the transportation network company, and they are really hesitant to share any data with the government, but they're running their operations within the city limit. So that creates a strange dilemma. So if they don't share the data, the government has no way to know how they run their operation, but they rely on the city and on the government to provide infrastructure support for their operation. So that goes way beyond the shared economy or shared mobility. That goes beyond to the AI and the procurement. So how do we put the data regulation and transparency in place? That's super, super important for AI development and for AI procurement.
Craig.
Yeah, no, like Jung Feng, yeah, thank you, Sharon and Kay, for this conversation tonight. Kay, thank you for your leadership in these issues, both here and around the world, as it relates to these important issues. Something that Kay said in the keynote that a number of things that struck me, but one was about the board members that they interviewed or surveyed, and how many of them didn't really understand, right, the various systems that they were oftentimes acquiring and then deploying and using. And it reminded me of something that I read. I think it may have been a report by Deloitte, if I'm not mistaken. But it talked about what it called the preparedness gap, right? And as we sort of move into this era of like pervasive artificial intelligence, that there is this gap in terms of our understanding and recognition of the social, ethical, and political implications of these systems. And so part of what I see our work as being about, right, is growing our knowledge, right, and further enhancing our understanding of these issues, but then also being able to translate, also being able to help inform decision makers, managers, and leaders. And so we oftentimes think about, tech literacy and knowledge and education for K through 12. But there's a growing recognition, right, that those who are in key management positions also need to have their knowledge greatly enhanced in terms of better understanding the implications of these systems for all of us. And so thinking about how we address the preparedness gap is something that I'm very interested in doing more work in.
Okay, thank you. Christine?
I too would like to thank Kay and the World Economic Forum for your thought leadership in this area. It is such a crucial issue to be addressed and very much appreciated. I did want to weigh in on the transparency bit because it does impact the commercial aspects as well. There's a lot of outrage from time to time about how a lot of ML is black boxed and you don't know really what the algorithms are that are driving everything. To borrow from Kay's statement that regulation kills innovation, to some degree, transparency kills innovation in this space as well. So there's a tension between the commercial aspect of this and sharing information openly that the consumers or the people whose data is being used need to know. I would say from a transparency perspective, of course, looking at the algorithm side, there's even experts in the field sometimes have a difficulty unraveling what it was even to mean if there wasn't a black box approach to these algorithms. And there's so many people involved in creating them that even people within the group that created them may not be able to explain from top to bottom the approach that was deployed and how to understand how the decisions are being made. So there's some complexities there, and I just wanted to voice kind of the opposing perspective that it does perhaps in some regards inhibit the commercial aspect of this by removing people's competitive advantage if you were to take it out of the black box.
Thank you, Christine. We're right at about time. Kay, any final comments?
Well, Amy, thank you very much for hosting this. And I guess that I think as a university, it's easy for me to say, oh, I need to do procurement. Now I need to look at board, and now I need to look at C-suite and this and this and this. And they're piecemeal pieces of what is actually the thing that we should be doing. And that is figuring out what we as humans want our future to look like. And then really thinking about what it is we should be doing. What are the solutions that we need for that? And I think as a university, you are uniquely placed to have that conversation and think about what our future looks like.
Great. Thank you so much. I'm going to thank all the panelists for this wonderful discussion. It is obviously just a kickoff. Well, it's not just, it's a great kickoff. But there are a lot of other events this week and you can register for them. They're available for you to check out on the Good Systems website. There's also a survey, an event survey, and I think the link to that is appearing on everybody's computers right now. So please register for those events. Thank you all so very much. Appreciate it very much. Good night.